Jeffrey Dahmer. The moment officers stepped into the apartment, the smell told them something was very wrong. It was July in Milwaukee, and the air inside the small unit was heavy and stale. The room was quiet except for the hum of a fan pushing warm air across the floor. One officer opened a drawer near the bed. Inside were photographs. They showed human bodies in stages of dismemberment. Arms, torsos, heads. The officers looked at each other, then quickly placed handcuffs on the man standing beside them. His name was Jeffrey Dahmer. For years, Dahmer had been living in that apartment building on North 25th Street. Neighbors sometimes complained about strange odors drifting through the hallways. Others heard power tools running late at night. Police had even been called to the building before, but the full picture never surfaced. Dahmer often met young men at bars and clubs in Milwaukee. Some were offered money to come back to his apartment for photographs. Once inside, the visits usually ended the same way. The victims never walked out. As detectives searched the apartment, they opened a refrigerator in the kitchen. Inside was a human head placed on a shelf next to food. In the freezer, they found plastic bags containing body parts. The investigation widened quickly. Police recovered barrels filled with chemicals used to dissolve remains. In total, 17 victims were eventually connected to Dahmer between 1978 and 1991. The truth had been sitting inside that apartment the whole time. Ted Bundy, he was the man investigators were searching for, who looked like everyone else. You see, witnesses described someone ordinary, a young man in his 20s, brown hair, clean clothes. Sometimes he wore a sling on his arm and asked strangers for help carrying books or loading a sailboat onto a car. The requests sounded harmless. Many people agreed to help. College campuses across Washington and Oregon were busy places in the early 1970s. Students crossed parking lots, walked between lecture halls, and waited at bus stops. On warm evenings, the air smelled like wet grass and lake water drifting through the city. Then the disappearances started. A student left a dormitory and never came back. Another vanished after walking to her car. Then another. Police reports began stacking up across different counties, each describing young women who had simply vanished during normal routines. The pattern slowly became clearer. Witnesses remembered the same detail: a polite man asking for assistance, sometimes introducing himself as Ted. He often drove a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle. Investigators began piecing the reports together. The victims were found miles away from where they disappeared, sometimes deep in wooded areas where hikers rarely traveled. The search intensified. Then Bundy made a mistake. After being arrested for kidnapping in Utah, evidence started linking him to the earlier disappearances in Washington. Detectives compared statements, photographs, and vehicle descriptions. The picture finally came into focus. The friendly stranger people remembered was the same man police had been chasing for years. Ted Bundy had been standing in plain sight. André Chikatilo. People kept dying, and no one knew who was responsible. Bodies were being found along railway lines, forest paths, and empty fields across southern Russia. Some victims were discovered near bus stops or wooded trails where people often walked alone. Others were left kilometers from the nearest town. Many were children or young women. At first, investigators believed they were dealing with separate crimes. The Soviet Union was vast, and local police departments worked mostly within their own regions. Reports were written. Evidence was collected. Then the files stayed inside district offices. Still, the killings continued. Witnesses sometimes remembered a quiet man near train stations, middle-aged, carrying a briefcase or a small shopping bag. Nothing about him looked dangerous. That made the investigation harder. By the mid-1980s, the number of victims had grown large enough that authorities formed a special task force. Hundreds of officers searched forests, questioned passengers, and monitored railway routes stretching hundreds of kilometers. The pressure kept building. Then, in 1990, officers watching a train station noticed a man repeatedly approaching women traveling alone. They followed him. His name was André Chikatilo. By the time he was arrested, investigators linked him to more than 50 murders committed over 12 years. For years, he'd walked through the same stations as everyone else. The killer had been standing among them the whole time. Harold Shipman. For years, patients walked into a doctor's office and never walked out alive. Many of them were elderly. Some came in with minor health problems. Others simply wanted prescriptions renewed. They sat in quiet examination rooms that smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper files. Then the deaths began. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Elderly patients died. Doctors signed the certificates. Families arranged funerals within a few days. Life in the town continued normally, but funeral directors started noticing something strange. One local undertaker realized that an unusual number of death certificates were being signed by the same doctor, Harold Shipman. Many of the victims had died suddenly at home. Several were elderly women who had been healthy only days earlier. The pattern slowly became harder to ignore. Shipman often visited patients alone. Afterward, relatives would return to find their loved ones dead in chairs or beds. Medical records showed natural causes: heart failure, old age. Yet investigators eventually uncovered a crucial detail. Shipman had access to diamorphine, a powerful opioid used in hospitals for severe pain. Toxicology tests later revealed lethal amounts of it inside the victims' bodies. The investigation expanded. Patient records were examined. Death certificates were reviewed. The numbers kept growing. By the time the inquiry finished, authorities estimated that Shipman had killed around 250 patients over decades. The man meant to protect their lives had been ending them. Pedro Alonso Lopez. For years, young girls kept disappearing across the Andes, and no one could explain why. Families noticed the same pattern again and again. A daughter left home for school, a small errand, or a walk to the market. The distance was short, sometimes only a few hundred meters. She never returned. At first, the cases looked unrelated. Villages in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru were separated by mountains, dirt roads, and days of travel. Police departments worked mostly within their own regions. Reports rarely crossed borders, but the disappearances kept adding up. By the late 1970s, dozens of children had vanished across hundreds of kilometers of rural terrain. Rumors spread between towns. Some families stopped letting their daughters walk alone. Someone was moving through those mountains. His name was Pedro Alonso Lopez. He traveled between villages and cities, often approaching girls in crowded markets and guiding them away toward quiet paths leading into the hills. The break came in Ecuador when Lopez tried to abduct a 12-year-old girl in a marketplace. Locals saw the struggle and chased him down. When police questioned him, the investigation changed. Lopez began leading officers into the countryside. At each stop, he pointed to the ground. Investigators started digging. Grave after grave appeared in the dirt. Entire hillsides had been used as burial sites. The mountains had been hiding the truth the whole time. Charles Manson. A group of young followers believed killing strangers would save the future. They lived together on a dusty ranch outside Los Angeles called Spahn Ranch. Old movie sets and broken wooden buildings stood under the hot California sun. The group called themselves a family. They followed one man, Charles Manson. Manson spent hours talking about an approaching race war he called Helter Skelter. According to him, chaos was coming. Society would collapse. His followers would survive and rise afterward. The message was repeated again and again. Music played on old radios. Long conversations stretched late into the night. Manson spoke quietly while others sat around him listening. Over time, belief slowly turned into obedience. Then the orders changed. In August 1969, several followers drove to a house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles. The property belonged to film director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate. Just after midnight, the attackers entered the house. Gunshots were heard. Screams followed. 5 people were murdered inside, including Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. The word pig was written in blood on the front door. Police soon traced the killers back to Spahn Ranch. The followers had carried out the murders. The voice behind them was Charles Manson. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. The sentence was later changed to life in prison. The man behind the murders never walked free again. Elizabeth Bathory. She was one of the most powerful women in Hungary, but surrounded by rumors of torture. Servants whispered about it long before authorities ever arrived. Inside Choctich Castle, in what is now Slovakia, young girls from nearby villages were brought through the gates. Most were peasants sent to work as maids. Some came from families hoping their daughters would learn noble manners. Many never returned home. At first, the disappearances were easy to ignore. The castle stood high above the countryside, surrounded by forest and thick stone walls. The nearest villages were several kilometers away. News traveled slowly across muddy roads and farmland. Still, the rumors grew. Villagers began noticing the same pattern. A girl left home for work at the castle. Weeks passed, then months. No letters, no visits. Servants later described punishments that became increasingly violent. Girls were beaten with sticks, forced to stand outside in freezing winter air, or burned with heated metal tools. The stories sounded impossible. Elizabeth Bathory belonged to one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary. Few people dared accuse her openly, but by 1610, the rumors had spread too far. When royal officials finally entered the castle, they found injured girls still alive inside the rooms. Others were already dead. The whispers had been telling the truth all along. Jim Jones. One man's command was about to decide the fate of an entire settlement. In a clearing deep in the Guyanese jungle, hundreds of people had gathered nearly 240 kilometers from Georgetown. The settlement was called Jonestown. Wooden cabins stood in rows under the heavy tropical heat, surrounded by dense rainforest and muddy roads that led nowhere fast. Most of the people there had followed Jim Jones for years. Jones had built the People's Temple as a church promising equality and community. Many followers sold their homes and moved thousands of kilometers from the United States to live in the remote compound. Life inside Jonestown slowly changed. Armed guards appeared. Loudspeakers played Jones's voice day and night. Meetings stretched late into the humid jungle nights. Then the outside world arrived. In November 1978, U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan visited the settlement to investigate claims that some residents were being held against their will. As he prepared to leave with defectors, gunmen from the compound followed him to a nearby airstrip. Shots echoed across the runway. Ryan and 4 others were killed. Back in Jonestown, Jones gathered everyone together. Large metal tubs were filled with a drink mixed with cyanide. More than 900 people died in that clearing. The jungle went quiet. The order had been obeyed.